when our identities and orientations might be recognized and celebrated. So if you have a few seconds to type up your answer, that would be great. Just go to menti.com and type in that code and you'll be able to give us your answer. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We'll start in a minute or two. Just as by way of introduction, we're inviting you to go to menti.com and you'll see it on the slide to answer that question, just to kick us off with a little bit of self-reflection. When you type your answer to that question, it will appear automatically on our screen, just so that you know that. Let's see, somebody else has written. Okay, we'll give one more minute, I think, and then we'll begin. In the meanwhile, if you've just arrived, please feel free to answer this question by going to menti.com and share with us if and how and whether your sexual orientation or gender identity had been celebrated or recognized. I see Melinda saying, what a hard question to answer as a cis hetero woman, white woman. I get the most joy in my trans child is properly gendered and celebrated for who he is. Yeah, that's very important. Thank you, Melinda. When we were reflecting on this question, when we were preparing for today's session, we wondered whether it would bring up the question of privilege, I suppose, cis privilege and hetero privilege. And so I guess your answer sort of speaks to that a little bit. That's how privilege works, is that when you have a category, identity category that is sort of unproblematized, you perhaps don't think about it as much. Although in your case, you probably had a lot of thinking to do in relation to your trans child. Somebody else says, boring, cisgender and hetero, so recognition and celebration are considered the norm for my orientation. Yeah, that's to my point. Thank you very much. So I think we can probably begin. We wanted to sort of have this question just to sort of orientate us towards today's topic. And this other person, thank you for contributing, says, I'm accepted at work and by most of my family. And I guess this speaks to the whole ethos of today, is the extent to which we are recognized and how we are recognized in social surveys. So thank you all for joining. We're going to start now. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our event, which is session 2 of a 4-part series, which we've called Queering Social Survey Research, Reimagining Measurements of Sex, Gender and Sexuality in South Africa. It's the brainchild of Specificities Mkhize, who, as you may recall, presented session 1 of the series. Specificities is a junior researcher at the Gauteng City Region Observatory, and he has conceptualized this with his colleague, Melinda Swift, who you see joining us also today, coming out of work they did on a quality of life survey, where they particularly asked questions of a SOGI nature. Stembiso then brought in a broader team to help conceptualize and imagine and run the series, including Julia De Cut of Site Savers, Tara Polson-Guato of Social Impact Insights Africa, and of course myself. I'm Pierre Brouard. I'm from the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. And with Stembiso as our lead, we've conceptualized this 4-part series. We also have joining us from Stembiso's team, Naledi Ngwenya, who will be giving tech support, and Voyisa Mkwanazi. Voyisa is going to prepare a report based on all 4 sessions. We'd like you to know that today's session will be recorded to facilitate the pulling together of the report. So please know that this session will be recorded. We'd also like to say that we're trying our best to make this a safe, queer space, that it is inviting and welcoming, and invite you to co-create that safety with us. I will share brief introductions of our speakers shortly, but just to welcome and acknowledge them: Carla Sutherland, who will not be here in person, but will share a recorded presentation; Sakhile Msweli, Niel Roux, and Eric Ndawula. So a bit of background on the 4 sessions and an understanding of the purpose of today. I guess it goes without saying that there's a growing recognition of the need to explore new approaches to understanding sex, gender, and sexuality in social scientific data. Despite improvements in LGBTQI+ rights, sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI, are 2 demographic dimensions that continue to receive not as much attention as we believe they should in large-scale surveys and official statistics. So this limits the ability of to generate quantitative evidence of socioeconomic and health progress of LGBTQI+ individuals, and thereby to develop services that are appropriate. The project brings together a range of people. Many of you are here today: qualitative and quantitative queer and feminist researchers, official statistic organizations, research institutes, to unpack the values of using queer and feminist lenses in survey development, and to understand some of the challenges experienced when sex, gender, and sexuality are measured in a particular social survey. So our aim is to contribute to imagining ways to reimagine these kinds of measurements when we do large-scale social survey research. Session 1, which maybe not all of you attended, so I'll briefly summarize for you, was an introduction to the series and asked why LGBTQI+ people are in fact ignored, or have been ignored largely, in social surveys, and why this is problematic. And we invited speakers then to share ideas about the value and purpose of LGBTQI+ inclusion. We heard in that session from government representatives, an academic, and a journalist about how they think of these questions. I thought it was a pretty powerful introduction to the series, and it made clear that the inclusion of queer people is necessary, not only from a social justice point of view, but because it makes possible the provision of intentional services to people on the queer spectrum, from scholars to health seekers and beyond. So this is session 2 of our 4-part series, and we're asking the core question: how do we capture complex identity phenomena in social surveys? The kinds of topics our speakers will speak to include the following: how do we ask social survey participants about sex, gender, and sexuality? What are some of the definitions we work with around SOGI terms? How do we respect local specificities and terminologies and naming? How do we balance the tensions between binaries and continuums in naming and not reinforce problematic binaries? In some contexts, legal identity status might not match self-identity, and there can be risks in certain identity labels. How do we protect people when we invite them to be part of our surveys? is there a different way to collect data and be inclusive in population studies versus more specific and targeted studies? And then finally, what might be some of the ethical challenges in asking about SOGI matters? So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers to you. I'm going to give you their brief bios, and then we will begin with the 4 presentations, bearing in mind that we will only have questions at the end. But I do believe that the presentations are of sufficient interest to keep us until the end. Our first presentation is from Carla Sutherland. Carla is a leading global expert on sexual orientation and gender identity issues in the global policy sphere. She holds a PhD in social policy from the London School of Economics and a master's in political studies and anthropology from the University of Cape Town. Today, she will speak to the session themes with specific reference to her involvement in a survey run by the other foundation, which was called Progressive Prudes. And she'll also reflect on a survey she's currently involved in the United States. Secondly, we have Sakhile Msweli, who holds a PhD in psychology from KZN and is working as a clinical psychologist in public service at Mgwelezana Hospital. Sakhile also works for the Wits RHI Trans Clinic in East London, focusing on the provision of gender-affirming healthcare. Sakhile is also a founding and board member of the Professional Association for Trans Health in South Africa and a member of the SASA SGD Human Rights Project. Sakhile will reflect today on questions of identity and naming. Then we have Niel Roux. Niel holds a master's degree in demography from UP and an MPhil in urban and regional science from the University of Stellenbosch. Niel is the director of service delivery statistics in Stats SA and has been leading the development and implementation of the annual General Household Survey across all stages of the statistical value chain since 2010. Since the survey covers a wide variety of topics, it's often used to pilot questions for wider introduction into other surveys and occasionally the census. Niel will shine a light on how this organization, a state body, might approach the complexities of capturing identity phenomena in social surveys. And then finally, we have Eric Ndawula, who's currently the executive director and founder of the Lifeline Empowerment Center, an organization that serves gay, bisexual, and queer men in their diversities through data-driven and needs-based protection and other services. Eric is a queer feminist and digital development enthusiast who strongly believes in the mainstreaming of cross-cutting issues such as wellness, youth, environment, gender, and disability for meaningful engagement and equity, all of which are critical in the realization of human rights for all in Uganda. Eric today will give us some insights into how queer inclusive social surveys might navigate the sensitivities and realities of a hostile social and legal climate. So we'll now begin with Carla's input, and I hand over to the tech team to play that presentation for us. Thank you all for being here.
Hi everyone, my name is Carla Sutherland. I'm speaking to you from my office in Brooklyn, New York. This is pre-recorded for the seminar series because it's some ungodly hour in the morning in New York, but I was really excited at the opportunity of sharing some of my ideas and experiences around how best to deal with issues like sex, sexuality, and gender in social surveys. I've called the presentation Untangling the Alphabet Soup in Social Surveys to begin to get at some of the complexities that can trip us up in surveys of this nature. And what I would like to do is to dive in and talk a little bit about the work that I've done that in the past 10 years or so that I'm drawing on in order to make the observations and the suggestions and the recommendations that I will in this presentation. The first study that I was involved with was when I was living and working in South Africa, which is where I'm from, at the Other Foundation. And we developed a study, a national study with the Human Science Research Council, developing a 32 question module on sex, sexuality, and gender that was embedded in the annual social attitudes survey that the Human Science Research Council does, I think on an annual basis. We participated in the 2015 attitudes survey. We worked with a number of well-known and well-respected academics from South Africa, including Pierre, who I understand is at the presentation today, and Finn O'Regan at the HSRC, who sadly died earlier this year, but who has done so much to advance our thinking in this area. The importance of that study was that it was the first of its kind that was developed by academics on the continent, looking at a nationally representative sample of South Africans around their attitudes towards homosexuality and gender conformity and non-conformity as a way of exploring transphobia. So because it was done with the HSRC, it involved directly interviewing over 3,000 participants in 8 different languages, which I think is incredibly important, because up until then, people were unsure of whether in social surveys, big social surveys like of this nature, whether participants had really understood some of the issues that were being explored. What do people understand by homosexuality? How could you really know if people thought they were talking about homosexuality, but in fact in their head had an idea around pedophilia or non-consensual sex between adults of the opposite sex? How to begin to sort of describe and engage with the ideas of non-conformity, of gender stereotyping, and so on. Often very academic concepts not grounded in people's lived realities and experience, or not described in the way that they might do that. So that was the one study, and it has advanced since then. It's being conducted in Malawi, it's being conducted in other sub-Saharan countries. It's been reviewed and refined as people have learned more about what works and what doesn't work. The second study that I'm going to draw on is one that I'm currently working on, which is the National LGBTIQ plus Women's Community Survey here in the States. And essentially, it's also the first study of its kind. It involves 170 question survey that was developed again by a group of academics and activists. And it really is to explore the kind of lived realities, experiences, joys, challenges of being a woman who centers other women in their lives. We've had over 11,000 people, 11,000 women who've participated in it, and we are currently exploring the results of that survey. And part of the reason I wanted to share it with you is that we spent a very long time trying to find new ways that would begin to capture the complexity of identity issues related to gender, sex, and sexuality. So I guess the two starting comments that I wanted to make around unpacking this this complicated alphabet soup that is developed to describe and capture who we are, LGBTQ plus, is the title of our survey, and I have seen much, much longer strings of alphabet of letters clung together. So the first thing I want to say when thinking about surveys of this nature and more widely writing about it, and forgive me if this is very commonplace, but I think that it's really important to distinguish between the issues of biological sex, gender in relation to identity and expression, and sexuality in relation to attraction, behavior, and identity. And I think that if you're going to be exploring these issues, developing different strategies around each of these areas is important, and being really clear about what aspect of this you want to be exploring is a critical first step to doing this well. So just quickly, biological sex, as you'll know, refers to the kind of hormones and chromosomes and reproductive organs that are different for male and female. That's the biological category of sex. Gender is the social construction of the meaning of biological sex. We're made into men and women as we work out or are socialized into an understanding of what roles we play as men and women, how we dress, how we present ourselves, how we talk, and so on. And for years people understood them as being exactly the same, but increasingly that's being undone. So gender identity is the kind of the gender that you most identify with. It's the one that you feel is who you are. And gender expression is slightly different. It's the way in which you present yourself on a masculine to a feminine spectrum. It's the clothes you wear, the makeup, jewelry, clothes, mannerisms. It's how you present yourself along those gender norms. And then sexuality is about who we are attracted to, and it's understood in terms of same sex, opposite sex, largely, but we'll break that down a little bit as well. Behavior, we're attracted to one kind of sex, but you could end up acting on that attraction or not. So your behavior of who you actually have sex with is different. And then there's the issue of identity. Do you see yourself as gay or queer or straight? What's the community that you feel like you belong to? And it's very easy to kind of squash all of these together. And it's really important to begin to break those down and to, see how these very, subtle but important differences between attraction, behavior, and identity play out. How people, there can be a massive difference between how people identify and how they actually express themselves. And of course, none of these have to, in fact, be related to the biological sex that we're born with. second thing to bear in mind when conceptualizing and designing a survey that is going to engage with these issues is breaking the binary. Often when we think about any of these issues, gender, sex, or sexuality, it's very often presented as either or. You're male or you're female. You're a man or you're a woman. You're straight or you're kind of gay or lesbian. And of course, this isn't true. And I think that what's becoming clearer over time is that, in fact, even the idea of a spectrum of then being no just separate polarized boxes, but that in fact it's more of a spectrum where people can be aligned somewhere along that line, stretching from the blue masculine through to the pink feminine. Even that is inadequate to begin to capture how much more colorful, joyful, and splendid all of these things can be, how they change over time, how if we're given the freedom of nonconformity, people will express themselves in a myriad of ways, so that increasingly people are talking less about a spectrum than about a kind of a kaleidoscope as a way of understanding it. All of which present very particular challenges if in a social survey, particularly if you're not doing qualitative research where you're sitting down and being able to talk through these ideas and unpack it with people, get their responses to it. How do you kind of grapple with some of these issues? So I'm going to start with biological sex in many ways. One of the easiest, but also one of the things that I just see done wrong or badly all the time. So the importance of biological sex is really, this is probably our one legal identity around any of these issues. Don't get a document that says whether you're gay or straight. You don't get a document that says whether you're a man or woman. But so much of our life is dictated by this legal entity of being male or female. It's on our birth certificate, it's on our marriage certificates, it's on our passports, and it runs all the way through almost all of the government administration that we have. And it's one of the clearest ways in which you can see the inadequacies of both a binary understanding of these issues, male or female, as well as a static understanding of these issues, this idea that it doesn't change and your gender is strictly related to your sex. So one of the worst ways in which you can ask questions about biological sex is in this very simple form of what is your sex, with these two options, male, female. It in no way captures any complexity or nuance. That's why that's in red. Getting better, and you'll see this more and more, is what sex were you assigned at birth? So an understanding that sex can change, an understanding with male, female, other, that these are not only a binary issue. It's not a great way of phrasing these questions, othering other people, making it feel like there are these two solid, understandable categories, and then there's this strange floating out here, one called other, which doesn't feel very inclusive. is not a great way to do it. So some of the ways in which people are exploring to deal with these issues in a more kind of nuanced way is by asking questions like that try and explain why you're collecting this. So we're collecting this data to compare health outcomes based on biological sex. And then the question, what sex is recorded on your birth certificate, with options of male, female, intersex. So that spectrum idea. Other, please specify so that people can begin to self-identify and play with these categories a little more. They may not feel that intersex adequately captures their own sexual, how they describe or understand themselves. And then I prefer not to answer, a recognition that some of these issues are very complex. In terms of gender identity, one of the important distinctions to draw is, and a smart way of asking is, are you cisgender or transgender or other? And also I prefer not to identify. Cisgender being someone whose biological sex and gender identity match up. Transgender indicating that that is not the case. So there's no judgment there. It's putting things on an even footing, and it's giving an other option, and I prefer not to answer. Another way of dealing with this question that captures the idea of change happening over time is to ask a question like, what best describes your gender currently and in the past? So you could say, created as a table man currently, but not in the past. Woman, not in the past, but currently. Non-binary, not at all. Gender fluid, gender queer, not at all. Other, and people have the opportunity to write things in. The way we dealt with it, because we were only looking at women, was to ask people, do you identify as a woman? And the 4 options that we offered were no, not ever. Yes, in the past, but not now. Yes, currently, but not in the past. And yes, always. So those are some ideas to think about. And more importantly, to think about some of the issues underneath it. Gender expression. One of the ways to deal with that is, what pronouns do you use? And there are some options there. And then what best describes, I like that idea of what best describing, so acknowledging that ideas change from strongly feminine through to strongly masculine, and others, and something in between. In relation to sexuality, again, drawing out the distinction between attraction, behavior, and identifying, being clear, identity, being clear about what you're exploring, and potentially exploring all of those depending on what you're working on. And to remember that, again, there's a spectrum of attraction and behavior. You could be drawn to the same gender, the opposite gender, both genders, being gender blind in the sense that that's not the issue. It doesn't define who you are attracted to, or no one, or just oneself. These are all kind of, as we break away from this understanding of, this is how sexuality works for everyone, this much more expansive attitude towards it. Then thinking also about structure of relationships in a more expansive way. Is it monogamous or non-monogamous? Are people single? And then relating to other partners, but really in terms of being in a relationship, being a solo person. Couples, thruples, that's a committed relationship between 3 people, and polyamorous, involved in a variety of ways with different people in monogamous or non-monogamous ways. And then identity, straight, gay, lesbian, bi, poly, queer. So just to bring this to a conclusion, I guess really what I wanted to draw out was to ask you to think carefully about why you are asking identity-based questions around these issues and thinking through how you will use the data that you get. I think lots of people ask lots of questions and then they don't really use the data. The best way, of course, to do that is to have a hypothesis of where you think particular impacts will be and be asking a set of questions against that. Explore for yourself how best to challenge pre-existing frames of sex, gender, and sexuality. Try and read widely in this area and be open to testing different ways and thinking about whether you're trapping yourself in a box and thinking about these questions of sex, gender, and sexuality in a very rigid way. Developing a post-colonial frame through language and culture, understanding that much of the literature, much of the writing about these issues has come from a particular colonial culture and a dominant white supremacist frame that has disregarded and not valued others' cultural contributions to this field. And I think that the Progressive Proof study provides a very rich data set in terms of the open-ended question that we asked in these different languages about how same-sex relationships and gender non-conformity was understood by participants and how they described it in their own languages. And I think that provides an amazing data set to be exploring some of these ideas and thinking about them against this backdrop of breaking down the binary and also unpacking gender, sex, and sexuality. And just as a last suggestion, as you maybe play with these ideas, is that I think that in our survey, some of the richest data has come from asking other and encouraging people to write their own descriptions and identity labels. And it's amazing the kind of ideas and insights that are coming through from that. And that at the end of every section around people's identity on these issues, we asked whether anybody would we asked an open-ended question of any other comment. And again, about 1 in 3 participants in our study took that opportunity and wrote these beautiful comments about how they thought about these issues, how it had changed over time, what they were grappling with, and so on. I'm sorry I can't be there for the discussion. I'm sure it's going to be amazing. I'm also sure that I spoke for much too long. If you want to explore any of these issues with me, then please just get hold of me at carla@justicework.org. I hope you enjoy the rest of the discussion, and apologies to panelists if I talk too long.
Well, I think Carla did a fabulous job there of setting the scene for our discussion today. And certainly in my own work at the University of Pretoria, I've grappled with a lot of these issues myself. For example, being consulted around how to ask demographic questions in our institutional culture survey, so that we can understand how the different communities in our UP community think about our institutional culture. And more recently, thinking about how we ask these kinds of questions when students register as a first year to start studying at the University of Pretoria. If we're going to ask these kinds of questions, it can inform the kinds of services we offer, and also perhaps more complexly, how we allocate and think about residence spaces. So I think these things are complex and challenging and not easy to grapple with, but that was a wonderful introduction. Niel, you are next speaker. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm speaking ahead of myself. It's Sakhile who's our next speaker. Sakhile, I know you're sitting in a rural space. I hope your connection is good. Can we invite you to open your camera and share some of your thoughts?
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you, everyone. So apologies, before I start, I need to acknowledge that, and we were saying this before everyone else entered, that I'm not at my own hospital, so I'm on outreach on the outskirts of the KwaZulu-Natal province, north, sort of north by northwest, we're 20 kilometers away from Swaziland border. And if you go north from where I'm currently based now, you are at the border of Mozambique. So the connection might not be great, and people might be walking in and around me as I try to share my thoughts, because I just had to find a corner to situate myself and sort of share my thoughts with you. And again, sorry for the headsets, but it's the only way I'm ever going to be able to hear myself or hear the other speakers talk. So Dr. Kara actually covered a lot of what I had intended to touch on today, but I sort of want to take a step back for us as we ask these questions about how do we capture SOGI data in our national surveys. And I thought one of the most important things that researchers and interventionists or academics working in this area need to be sensitive to is context, right? And we cannot speak about context without speaking about our history as a country. So I'm hoping to really go back to that and just setting the scene, and then also looking at ethics, and then I'm sort of just going to run with my train of thoughts in terms of what I think we can do moving forward. So it goes without saying that there is a lot of queerphobia in our country, which stems from our history, our colonial history, where majority of beliefs at the time, even now, what prevails is the policing of sexuality and gender identities that may be seen as diverse. And as a result of that history, we've sort of lost a lot of what sounds like, if you pay attention to it, what sounds like acceptance and understanding of gender and sexual diversity within African communities. So what this has led to, of course, is the erosion of queer persons within spaces, is the erosion of sexuality and gender diversity as being valid within those spaces. And part of this, of course, we've sort of inherited as we took up foreign religions and laws. But to pay more attention to then our context in terms of our apartheid past, which I think is important again, that we think about that if we're thinking about national surveys and data collection, because it feeds into intersectionality and certain privileges and oppressions that certain groups of people face and certain bodies or persons are sort of objected to. So if you think about Group Areas Act, it just automatically means there has been limited, because certain groups of people were moved away from the cities and resources and economic hubs. Geographically, our country still bears those scars. And even now, the provision of healthcare is sort of influenced by that history. And if you're thinking about, the progressive prunes like Dr. Carla was saying, or your sub-sum surveys, or your census surveys, that history very much still has a strong hold on us, because for data collectors to get the data, they need to go into someone's homes. And depending on your race, socioeconomic status, educational level, there's a certain type of person who we expect to find in the locations, we expect to find in some parts of our country, which some consider slums, or others consider informal settlements. And it automatically, being in that space automatically means there's limits to confidentiality, right? Because if I'm going to be asked questions about my sexuality, which from my previous point, we know there's still quite a lot of queerphobia, but you're asking me about my sexuality and my family is right across the room or they're next door and the room is not soundproof, it means there are already issues of anti-disclosure, which could be problematic for the participant and also for the researcher, because then it fits into ethical dynamics. So issues of housing, where are we collecting the data and how are we collecting the data becomes quite problematic. And they're problematic because they have their roots based in our apartheid and colonial past, and feed into the intersectionalities where queer people and queer folk find themselves oftentimes. So I think as we start thinking about how do we collect this data, part of that is I think that we need to be aware of and cognizant of and sensitive towards. We have to also acknowledge, I have to also acknowledge the achievements that we've been able to achieve as a country, particularly, social science researchers and scholars working within the space of gender and sexuality. Although we Carla sort of touched on it, that majority of the studies have been targeted. I'm thinking of the programmatic mapping study that was done by the HSRC and size estimate studies that were done by the HSRC that were looking at key populations, your transgender persons, your MSMs, your gay and bisexual identifying persons. So even though those studies were very targeted, where a lot of what was used is snowballing, and from there getting access to gatekeepers, it still doesn't help us at a national survey type of level, although it provides very much useful information for us. So then also part of what we have to acknowledge is the change of attitudes that is there amongst South Africans. I don't think we are at a place where we were 15 years ago in terms of integration of queer folk within communities. It saddens me to say that it is certainly not where we want it to be. And we know this because of the rampant killing and the ongoing killings of queer folk within communities. And the fact that oftentimes queer folk have limited access to services only because of their sexuality and gender. So then how do we capture this information becomes a very tricky question to answer. And for me, I want to say that we have to acknowledge that within our country, we are in relatively infancy levels of doing this work. But we know that there's been such rampant and rapid changes in our own understandings as researchers and as professionals, academics working in the space. Terminologies that we were using, terminologies that we were using 5 years ago are dated, as we see with the SOC8, and the new guidelines from the HIV Commission's guidelines. Terminologies change. And because there's always there seems to be this ramping up of knowledge production within the academic space. However, all of this knowledge that we are getting is not necessarily translated into communities where quite a significant number of queer folk find themselves. And so my own question that I oftentimes grapple with is how much of what we're doing is about us in conferences and coffee rooms, and how much of that really links to lived experiences of queer folk across the country in different set of settings, which becomes problematic if you want to do a national survey. You want to capture this data because you have to be sensitive to the diversity of our country, which has a very rich history of separation and difference, which has a very rich history of diversity in and of itself, before we get to issues of SOGI. And so our language in the academic space has evolved, but I wonder about traditional languages. I wonder about African languages, whether or not they've been given a space to evolve along with the academia. And I think this is a significant point because it also speaks to the issues of construct validity, and dare I say whether or not our findings are reliable at the end of the day when we draw our conclusions. Because like Dr. Carla was saying, we sort of a space where we understanding that gender is separate from sex, biological sex. We are at an understanding that sex, gender are separate from sexuality. and expression. And so as a scholarship, as academia, as researchers working in this space, we have that understanding. But lay people in communities struggle with that understanding. People in other fields or disciplines struggle with and wrestle with these ideas when presented with them. And so how much of our conceptualization when we're sitting and we're thinking about interventions and these studies that we want to go out and collect data for, how much of those constructs really are in line with lived experiences? And therefore, what can we comment around construct validity if we're going to go into a space and ask people about pronouns, but they don't necessarily even understand what the pronoun is? And so whatever information we get is sort of surface level and hasn't been sort of synthesized by the said individual and such that they are able to position themselves as a true reflection really to whatever we are asking them. So I think going forward, if we are truly going to be able to get a space to ask this question, we need to also take up the role as interventionists, as academics, as researchers. We need to take up the role of ensuring that we are truly capturing what we are intending to capture. That the people that we are asking these questions actually understand the questions themselves, right? And this goes over and above the question of whether or not you're asking the question in English or isiZulu or isiXhosa, but it's about, do people understand this construct? Are they in line with, as their understanding in line with the understandings of the researchers? And excuse me, I like what Dr. Carla was talking about when she was querying, you know, who does this research? Who's benefiting from this research? Why are we collecting this particular data? And how are we collecting it? I think that is very important because we have to always be conscious that we're coming to an individual who is navigating their identity, whether it's their sexual identity or their gender identity within spaces that are quite unsafe. And so when we do this research, our research within this space has to be research that is rooted in safe spaces, right? So it's research that needs to create a safe space for the participant. It's research that needs to acknowledge that disclosure in and of itself could be triggering and quite damaging to the person answering these questions. And I think, you know, if I was to give a knee-jerk reaction, I would say communities need to be prepared. We need to take these ideas of gender being separate from sexuality and sexual orientation. We need to do the work of going to communities, whether or not we're sampling them or not, but saying, this is how we are understanding this. How can you translate this into your own understanding? Asking more open-ended questions like Dr. Carla was saying, which I know for quantitative research is quite problematic to have a survey with open-ended questions. Would it work? But then let us then lay the grounds before going into doing and collecting this data. So we know that our constructs are really in line. They're congruent with the participants' understanding. And I think there's a lot that could be learned from the COVID research that was done, where a lot of it was taken into digital space. Again, we need to think about intersectionality. What does that mean? Because the majority of the people in our country are not going to have access to Wi-Fi. I had to bring my own Wi-Fi from home and plug it in because I was worried that I'm not going to have connection today. So those are the realities of the people that live within our communities where we want to collect data. And oftentimes we're missing those queer folk if then we take data collection into digital space. So it's really, I think it's an acknowledgement that even when you're writing for grant proposals, that we need to be conscious of the fact that each community will have a certain type of need that the other wouldn't have. But at the basis of it, that our research needs to create safe space for people and acknowledging derogatory terms that are used within communities and saying, why is that derogatory term still so pervasive? Why is it being used? Is there because there's no alternative that has been presented to the people within that community? Or as academia progressed, sort of lay and local language sort of stagnated, and we now need to go back and say, let us update local language, so that it is aligned and in line with our scientific thinking around these issues. I can see you, Pierre. I'm not sure if I'm doing okay with time.
If you could wrap up, Sakhile, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me wrap up. So, how do we ask? I think it's important that we come from a place of acknowledging that we ourselves are quite unsure of how to ask these questions. I think if we're congruent about that and we train our data collectors to be super sensitive to these issues and the privileges that they oftentimes have coming in and asking people these difficult questions, because as much as behavioral studies are significant, self-identification, I think, is key. And a person can only truly self-identify once they've been provided with all the options that really speak to themselves and that are sort of congruent with what we are also wanting to find out. I think I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sakhile. I think you really spelled out the politics of research, and I think some of the tensions between quant and qual approaches, and also I think the tension between ideas of the researcher and the researched. So I think that's really, in a sense, dug deeper into some of the broader questions that Carla had raised. So thank you very much for that. We go next to you, Niel. You've been involved in large-scale surveys. Perhaps you can give us some of your insights, please.
Thanks, Pierre. I just want to quickly put this presentation up, share a screen. This one, and I can wait. Can all of you see the presentation?
Not yet from my side.
Okay, so, I apologize for that. Just going to take a minute. Oh, sorry, it's that one. I'll share. And
yeah, now we're seeing something has come up. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, lovely. Is the presentation visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, lovely. Yes, as Pierre said, my name is Niel Roux. I'm from Statistics South Africa, and I'm absolutely petrified to talk to you guys. I mean, the academic and the non-government sector has always been much more interesting than government. You know, I often think if you look at government, this is really how government looks like. The EU has changed over a number of years, but we basically still remain very measured and conservative in how we implement our surveys and how we go along to ensure that we measure the things that needs to be measured in society. So going forward, perhaps just quickly talking about the background to the GHS, and then I want to attend to a number of specific issues which my co-presenters have already mentioned, and which I think they have made excellent points, which hopefully will also be able to touch on, and I'm not sure we can expand on that. Just excuse me if I do cough a bit. I have a bit of I had a bit of bronchitis, and I'm trying to recover from that, so just apologies. The General Household Survey is a survey that provides critical assessment of the levels of development in a country. And we look at a number of factors, or themes rather, which includes everything from household structures to education to ECD. And then also it extends into service delivery issues, water sanitation, ICT, and agriculture, and so forth. And the survey was first introduced in 2002. It replaced the October Household Survey, which was done from about 1993 onwards. Now, the survey, for those of you who don't know, it's an annual cross-sectional survey. So we do it on an annual basis between January and December. So we start in January and we do a sample of about 33,000 households is implemented across the 12 months at increments of about 2,500 a month. We do face-to-face surveys, with the exception of the last 2 years. During COVID, we did CATI surveys, but it's mostly face-to-face surveys using CAPI. That's the computer-assisted personal interview system. And also, we use proxies where necessary in the GHS, but some of our sister surveys, the GPSJS and the DTS, you actually find interviews with, in the case of the GPSJS, and this is important for a later point, you find interviews that are with randomly selected individuals, and in the DTS, there's a short interview of every single person in the household. The target population, basically all private households and residents that live in workers' hostels across the country. So we exclude, as you can see, people who live in communal quarters, old age homes, hospitals, prisons, military barracks, and so forth. Our coverage, looking at the geographical hierarchy, we can provide statistically significant data down to a metro level, individual metro level. So in other words, we can provide data for each and every metro. But unfortunately, our data do not allow us to provide data on sub-provincial level, in other words, district, municipality, or municipal level, or any other level. But that is something that we're presently working on to, and that will of course mean expanding our sample size. Okay, and then maybe I'm getting to the gist of this, since I don't want to take much more than 10 minutes. We have realized for quite a while that it's important to expand the questions that we've been using. In Stats South Africa, those of you who know the products would have seen that we've been using the same questions, domain variables in particular, since probably the 1990s, if not earlier. And it's become clear that we need to review things like sex and sexuality and gender identity, as well as population group for that matter. There's been a lot of pressure on population group. In South Africa, although it's not clear what percentage of the population is transgender, a lot of studies, including some of those been mentioned today, have shown large health disparities, across time and across these different populations. But yet we do have little information about the socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, etc. And because the GHS is particularly designed to look at these things, it is important for us to establish how we could implement some of these aspects into a survey like the GHS, so that we can create better understanding of the subgroup. However, in saying so, there are a number of limitations which would limit the deadline for implementation. As it currently stands, the survey is implemented in January every year, like I've mentioned. So the earliest possible implementation, for instance, of any of these steps would probably be 2024, but most likely only by 2025. And I'll expand on some of the reasons shortly. As I've mentioned, the timelines, sorry again. The timelines will really be because we are careful and measured. We are government officials, and since the GHS has got a very long extended time series, one of the big things that we're trying to do is we have a bit of anchor bias in a sense that we're trying to protect that time series as much as we can. And as a consequence, we are also bound by very strict standards that we have to follow within Statistics South Africa in the implementation, development, testing of any new questionnaire items. And this, of course, would also then link to the next facet, and these items will probably be developed for implementation in something like the GHS, but afterwards, after it's been standardized and approved, it have to be ready to also be implemented across other surveys like the DTS and GPSJS, which I've mentioned earlier, but also in principle, something like the QLFS or even income expenditure survey. Excuse me if I'm using a lot of acronyms. We can maybe expand on some of those a bit later if it's important. We presently use, essentially in terms of our demographic variables, we only use one question in as far as it's related to sex and gender identity, or sexuality and gender identity. We basically ask whether a person is male or female. And that is true for all our surveys, including the census. And the data is largely used for weighting or of our various samples. In other words, we have a sample of 33,000 households. We realize about 20,000 of those. And if we then bring back the data, we have to apply a weight to that each particular household, each particular individual, to try and assess how many people in the real world they represent, given the mid-year estimates that we use. So for us, it's very important to have a clear sense of how many people are male and female, or considered male and female. However, what we increasingly realize, of course, is that's almost kind of forcing a reality. And of course, it also creates in a lot of other questions. How do we address our own requirements with a new need out there? And of course, as you, maybe not from your particular view, but from our particular view, that's a real important issue that we need to address also going forward with the questionnaire developments. So new categories could have a far-reaching impact on the time series and also on issues like weighting. So within Stats South Africa, there are a number of guidelines which we then have to be looking at. I don't want to elaborate too much on them, but essentially it's a comparability across time, across surveys. Then also in terms of population surveys, it's the best practice issues, which I think we follow countries that have luckily progressed quite significantly, like Canada and Australia quite closely, and also the NSO, the National Statistical Office in the UK. But as you would understand, those are mostly different realities. Those are European countries which have a different population of different understanding of issues. And this is exactly one of the issues which I'd like to outline in a moment's time. And also our questions need to be fit for purpose. In other words, it needs to be fit for the methodology and the mode of data collection that we're particularly following. So I was glad that the same questions were asked by the two previous speakers. Essentially, what will the data be used for? In our case, we mostly use data, or at least the people who use the data use it to count these so-called subgroups or to illuminate the so-called subgroups. That, of course, will have an impact on how it should be asked. And then also, and this is very important for us, because our sample is quite large, 33,000 dwelling units, it means that we have a sample that's distributed right across the country amongst different geographical areas. Now it's informal areas, rural areas, deep rural areas, peri-urban areas, inner city. So it's different areas, different populations, but also different language and cultural groups, which makes, of course, something like this very, very important that we manage to ask it in a way that there is a clear understanding across these different groups. We recently did a study on even just the questions we asked on the categories, the response options used for water access. And we realized that many people didn't understand the categories the way in which we've been asking them for many, many years, which has really raised the question about when you introduce things that are even more contextual. Okay, so some of the other considerations that we take into consideration in a population survey is that, because we're a population survey, we already are quite a large survey with more than 400 items. We can only ask a limited number of questions. So, and also open-ended questions are a no-no, mostly because it's so difficult to recode them and to code them consistently over time afterwards. So that is one of the main considerations that we have. There are also some issues of the general principles, which I'm going to deal with in the next slide. Consistent understanding is absolutely crucial. Do people understand the terms, and do they understand these terms in their own languages or within their own cultural environments? But also, more importantly, because we are using field workers, do those field workers understand these terms, and how do they relate to these terms? So this brings us to things like language translation and culture, which is often a very big constraint in a large survey like this. Of course, also we're talking about the completeness of the experiences and response options. When we've got a questionnaire like this, you're bound to exclude something or somebody. particularly also when people don't understand these options the same way in which it's been understood by us in Pretoria. And then the last thing I think is also, and this is a major consideration and fear for us, is that in the GHS at least we use proxy research, we use proxy respondents. In other words, we use, if a field worker get to a dwelling unit, we would use anybody over the age of, well, we hope to talk to the head of the household, but if we don't talk to the head of the household, which is of course by itself a bit of a problematic item, we can interview anybody that's 16 years and older about everybody else in the household. So most of the questions that we're asking are relatively objective. In other words, it's questions that the people know the answers to, except where you maybe get to things like household income and so forth. And there we really want people to talk to, individuals that are working and bring in money. But the moment that your questions kind of veer slightly away from very objective questions, it becomes more problematic, we found in the past. But we will deal with that in a second as well. Okay, so the general issues that we've got in terms of the design and implementation of the questionnaire is the mode of administration. We currently use field workers. In other words, we use an interviewer for a CATI or a CAPI survey. However, we are also looking at the self-administered option of a COWI. This is internet, of course, and this would have big implications in terms of confidentiality, but also in particular, it would have an implication in terms of how free people would be to answer some of these answers. Also, in terms of the pronunciation and definition of key terms, this is absolutely vital. And we don't have a lot of experience in this, I'm afraid. This is something that, for us, is something that we need to try and understand. Item ordering effects, this is crucial in a survey like ours. We normally try and add issues that could provide any discomfort. And, sorry, again, believe it or not, this is probably one of those items which many of our more traditional respondents might feel discomforting, is where do you put it, so that the rest of this 400 items are affected as little as possible. And this is also something that we need a lot of testing and also a lot of assistance with. Proxy responding, I've spoken with, and then a field worker sensibilities. We have about 253 field workers that work permanently on GHS and the DTS and GPSS. And they've been full-time since 2011. Sincere apologies. Many of them are also probably over the age of 50. Many of them are closer to 60. And they've got their own sensibilities, which also sometimes makes it very difficult to introduce questions like this. We've had issues with even asking about female sanitary products. We've had some pushback, believe it or not, and similar little things. And for us, it's very important also when we introduce the questions, not only to take into account the population that we are going to ask this from, but also our field workers. The last two slides are really then, I'm sorry again, consistent understanding. I think the consistency of understanding will actually start with us, in government service. Like I've said, we are measured relatively conservative, and we haven't really had a lot of, either by design or choice, exposure to many of these items. However, since we are being pushed into this, there needs to be also a sensitization amongst the team itself. And then, of course, that will have to be translated into a broader understanding. For cisgender respondents, we often find that people don't understand these terms the same way. What does transgender mean? What does cisgender mean, for that matter? And also, our biggest fear is that we could have a kind of a type 2 error, a misclassification of individuals. If the figure that you've got in the United States is correct, let's just make an assumption. We're talking about 0.6% of the population. We can barely afford any kind of margin of error around that, given the fact that we're really talking about roughly a 0.5% margin. Then also transgender respondents will, of course, have a very similar challenges. In other words, what dimensions are being queried, the categories comprehensive, are the terms universal and how they're affected by cultural language, etc. And I think with this, I'll stop now and we can hopefully answer more on the questions. I hope I didn't take too much time, Pierre. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Niel. There's a lot to say on these topics, and I think you've really spelt out for us very beautifully the complexities of running such a large-scale survey of this nature, challenges around the technologies, the methods that you use. So we really appreciate your input. Eric, you are our final speaker today. You bring a perspective from Uganda. Welcome, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. I am here. Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Yeah. Yes, it's afternoon in Uganda. Good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to share my screen in a moment. My name is Eric Ndawula. I am Executive Director and Team Leader at Lifeline Empowerment Center. Briefly about Lifeline. Lifeline is a gay, bisexual, and queer young men organization, and I want to thank everyone who has been able to present earlier on. I'm really just going to build on what you've said. And from the perspective, I'm really going to be speaking mostly, I don't know, is my screen able to be seen?
Yes,
can you see my screen?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Again, my name is Eric Ndawula, and I'm just building on what really the presenters have already presented, mostly on where I'm going to focus on is where queer surveys are actually meeting hostile environments. And you forgive me, I say the conference and the different seminars series actually focused on South Africa, but coming from Uganda, I've not been to South Africa myself, but I've read a lot about South Africa and the progressiveness within the LGBTQ rights. However, I'm also aware that we still face similar challenges, even in countries that maybe have decriminalized homosexuality, or maybe the laws are a little bit friendly. Still, you'll see that different LGBT people meet with different cultural norms and religious norms and personal norms that do not want to agree with the issue to do with diversity and existence of other people who are different from them. So my focus really today is going to be about queer surveys meeting hostile environments, and I want to focus a little bit on Uganda and also other African countries, especially those that have not yet decriminalized homosexuality or that have not decriminalized same-sex relations. In continuation, homosexuality is still a crime in most African countries. And as you can see clearly, religious and cultural norms are still a big hindrance to queer rights, because you find that most of the decision makers base, especially the lawmakers, based on making laws that are basically giving religious leaders the audacity to make decisions on behalf of a country like Uganda, where our motto is "For God and my country." You find that most of our laws are going to be based on the Bible or based on what the culture says, but not really about what are the aspirations of the people, what are the motives, what are the current trends, or what is actually happening on the ground, especially in regards to people that are marginalized, like the LGBTQ people. Discussions can happen in parliament about laws, but for as long as it's about homosexuality, you hear people bringing out the Bible, you hear people bringing out their cultural norms, you hear people bringing in the African culture, which does not basically even exist, because Africa is diverse. Africa is defined as a continent which is full of different people speaking different languages, believing different things. So it's quite funny when someone talks about the African culture and yet they cannot really explain it. And I'm speaking to a lot of academics and researchers in the room and other leaders. I come from a perspective of a community member, and as my own experience, this is what I'm here to share. So in the Ugandan context, these are some of the laws that actually affect us as an LGBTQ person. Under the Penal Code Act, Section 145 mentions about unnatural offences, and you find that this similar law was copy and pasted by mostly the colonialists in different countries, especially the British countries and other, the British protectorates and others. Unnatural offences that any person who has carnal knowledge against the order of nature is liable to life imprisonment, and this still exists, and sometimes it's actually owned by our country in when you see other laws that could come up, like the sexual offences bill that was being proposed by Parliament. The same article, the same section was actually just translated into there. Either having carnal knowledge against an animal or permits a male person to have carnal knowledge of him or her against the order of nature. It should be noted that before this amendment, the law initially just criminalized same-sex between man and man, but now it went ahead and included females. And the life imprisonment is still the punishment. When you look at Section 146, the attempt to commit unnatural offences, that mentions about any person that attempts to commit any of the offences specified in the sections above, commits a felony and is liable to imprisonment for 7 years. Funny enough, how they're going to know that you're about to commit unnatural offences. So it could be from you identifying as gay. It could be from you identifying as lesbian. And so first you have intentions of committing unnatural offences. Even though you can see the ambiguity that comes with these sections, that they do not specifically mention about LGBTQ people. These laws have actually been used against LGBTQ people, including myself. In 2019, I was arrested and subjected to forced annual examination, specifically mentioning that I identify as a gay man, so I must have had unnatural offences. And to prove that, they have to check where unnatural offences happen from on part of your body. You can just imagine. Section 148 talks about, again, we are still in the Penal Code Act, Cap 120, the amendment of 2000. Section 148 mentions about indecent practices, where any person who, whether in public or private, commits any act of gross indecency with another person, or procures another person to commit any act of gross indecency with him or her, or attempts to procure the commission of any such act by any person with himself or herself with another person, whether in public or in private, commits an offense and is liable to imprisonment for 7 years. So you can just imagine, whether you identify as an LGBT person or not, this section can also arrest you, but it has mostly been used against LGBTQ people, because what is mostly defined as indecent in a country like Uganda is mostly about homosexuality or immoral acts. So in continuation, there was an attempt to bring the Anti-Homosexuality Act, but I want to note that even this one was very, very much explicit, and maybe you've heard of it, where it was very explicit on what homosexuality means, rather than the unnatural acts that was not really defining what does homosexuality mean in there, or what unnatural offences mean. But here they explained what homosexuality meant and what kind of punishments are there, including death and life imprisonment. Death for aggravated homosexuality and life imprisonment for homosexuality as a crime in the country. The law was passed, however, its effects still live with us in Uganda as a country. The Constitution itself prohibits marriage between people of the same gender, and in the amendment that was signed by the president, marriage between people of the same gender was strictly prohibited. And we saw last year a number of 54 LGBTQ people who were found at a per se gay wedding were arrested and charged under this law, but also charged for flouting lawful orders, where the president mentioned that everyone must stay home to protect themselves from COVID-19. What does this really exactly mean? And I want to relate it back to research and data and surveys. So it causes some problems. Problem number one, in my own perspective, and in the perspective of the communities in Uganda, the LGBT community is underground. And that means that as a researcher, as a person who's looking for data specifically for LGBT people, you need to find them in the most creative ways. If you are, for example, a researcher from South Africa and is doing research on Uganda, will have to collaborate with an organization that is specifically working on LGBTQ issues in Uganda to be able to access that community, because the community is underground. You cannot find them freely identifying themselves being queer if they're not bold enough to be online, but not in physical spaces. Even though I am bold enough to be out there online, I cannot be out there on the streets of Kampala or in the streets in Uganda to say that, hey, I'm gay and here I am. So because you're then creating attention to yourself, but also trying to see that people are going to attack you. So the community goes underground, and that means collecting data from such a community becomes quite difficult. And, identifying as queer, and this is the second problem, identifying as queer physically on paper is a risk, and the person participating in the survey. So you'll find that the LGBT community will not trust a person who's not of their own to give them information or to give them data, whether they're collecting it online or physically, because we are not sure what are they going to use the data for. In recent years, especially during the passing of the Anti-Homosexuality Act, we saw that there are a lot of people who misuse data that belong to the LGBT community. And newspapers finding lists of participants in a workshop and listing and going ahead and publishing the names of these people in newspapers with a headline, "They're after our children, kill them." So you find that when data is being misused or lands in the hands of wrong people, it can become a higher risk. Now, for a population like the LGBT community, trusting you with their data, identifying as LGBTQ people, even though the survey might come and ask about, oh, what is your sexual orientation? And they are not quite sure about the objectives of this survey. You'll find that it's very difficult to give you such information. And unless you're going to quite take them through what are you going to use the data for, why is it important that they have to disclose their sexual orientation or their gender identity? So it's quite difficult. And, the state does not take into account the existence of queer people. That means they do not plan for queer people because they do not have data that is supporting their existence. So they will continuously deny that we exist. They will talk about, no healthcare for you because we don't have any data supporting your challenges that you face as a queer person. So you find yourself that you have to exist within an already existing population, which is quite challenging. In continuation, there are some consequences to these challenges and these things that are existing. When there is no planning for queer people's needs, as I earlier mentioned, so how does a queer person be able to access healthcare that speaks to them? Gender-affirming therapy for transgender people and gender non-conforming people. It's not there because the government cannot procure such healthcare for people that they do not exist in their own context. Because when you look at the national census that was done like 8 years ago, it does not talk about sexual orientation or gender identity. So they will not plan for us. Talking about data being collected by organizations remains with donors and on the shelves of the organizations, but it never really influences policies because the legal environment has outlawed queer people. So organizations that have taken on the mantle to collect data from queer people about their challenges, about their needs, they cannot share this information with the government. They cannot share this information with the police. So the only way that you collect the data, but you just share it with donors who have given you the funding, or you just use it to influence a small project that is just on your organization or on a community level, really, but it's not going to inform a policy at national level. And that is because the laws that have been existing, you cannot go on and maybe give in a position paper to the parliament, because now the parliament will just be incited to maybe come up with a law that just criminalizes people. I remember we have the pigeonholes in the parliament where an LGBTQ organization took on the mantle to share a report about LGBTQ people, about their challenges in accessing health care. And when the parliament were able to grab this report, they used that information in that report to rather come up with a law that criminalizes people. I know I'm about to conclude. The data that is collected might be misused, and this has been done in the past where people do not have accountability about the data they collect on LGBT people. The challenges that come with data ethics, people are not ethical and do not have data integrity when they collect data from LGBT people. And definitely we shall see more exclusions happening if the data that is collected is misused or it's not actually inclusive of LGBTQ people. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope we could make change altogether by including LGBT people in data surveys, but also being ethically responsible and integral to the data that we collect. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eric. That was such an important reminder of some of the privileges we have in South Africa. But I think Sakhile's presentation alerted us to the fact that even when you have a generous constitutional dispensation, it isn't guaranteed that people will feel safe in some more rural communities, for example, to complete a survey of the kind that would be interesting to us. But I think what you showed so vividly is when you have a hostile legal and political and social climate, it's almost impossible to collect data. And so, of course, it contributes to the idea that the queer community doesn't exist because they're too afraid to participate in studies of this nature. We have unfortunately run out of time. We had planned a small poll and hopefully some time for a Q&A. I think we've learned our lesson. For the next session or two, we might probably only have 3 speakers to allow more time for engagement, but we'd like to thank you on behalf of the whole team for being present today, and to our presenters for such a wonderful, rich presentations and information that's really given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much, and we look forward to your participation in the next session. Take care, everybody.